Felipe II, the King of Spain, had a tough time keeping the Netherlands, one of his realms, under control. The Dutch had rebelled against his measures. The king sent an army north to deal with the troublemakers. But after 10 years of war, two states, Holland and Zeeland, still carried on their rebellion. The Governor-General for the Low Countries, Don Luis de Requesens Zúñiga, had passed away, and Felipe sent his illegitimate half-brother Don Juan to the Netherlands to replace him. Before he made the journey, Don Juan forced Felipe to sign off on the Enterprise of England. The Enterprise was a plan of Irish and English Roman Catholic exiles to turn that Protestant country Roman Catholic again. The king allowed Don Juan to use the Spanish troops stationed in the north, invade England, free and marry Queen Mary of Scotland, remove Queen Elizabeth, and crown himself King of England. The wars against the rebel Netherlands and the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean cost a lot of money. Money Felipe didn't have. The king had declared Spain bankrupt. The Spanish, Italian, and German soldiers weren't paid, and savagely plundered states where the people had thus far been loyal to the king. The Spanish fury in Antwerp had been particularly violent. And now all 17 states were mad at their lord. The leader of the rebellion, Prince Willem of Orange, rallied people behind his cause to kick out the Spaniards. There were basically three groups in the Netherlands: the fiercely Protestant rebellious Holland and Zeeland, the fiercely Roman Catholic loyal southern states, and everyone else that hadn't picked a side yet. They were, however, all united in their mutual hatred for the foreign soldiery. The loyal states wanted to get rid of the king's army, but they needed Holland and Zeeland's experienced troops to do it. While the mutinies of the foreign soldiers raged through the country, Prince Willem of Orange used the crisis to get everyone around the table and talk peace. Orange warned the loyal states they had declared the royal troops outlaws. If they believed that Felipe would consider that move anything but lèse-majesty, they'd be dead wrong. Whether they liked it or not, they had already joined the rebel alliance. Might as well make it official and get a peace agreement in place. The States General met with the Prince and representatives from Holland and Zeeland in Ghent, while the citadel there was still under siege by the Flemish and Colonel Olivier van den Tempel. The Prince stayed far away from religious issues and political change, but kept piling on about those bad Spaniards. He explained that they needed unity. Look at how Holland and Zeeland had bested the royal troops. Imagine what all united 17 states could do. They needed to be firm. The king considered the movement in the Netherlands a mere conspiracy of individuals. Willem said, "The king told me himself in 1559 that if the estates had no pillars to lean upon, they would not talk so loud. Everyone from the nobles to the clergy to the citizens had to shout in one voice against the King of Spain, so he would listen. But they also needed to be careful. Their foe was a swindler," he said. "The old tricks are again brought into service, therefore it is necessary to ascertain your veritable friends, to tear off the painted masks from those who, under the pretense of not daring to displease the king, are seeking to swim between two waters. 'Tis necessary to have a touchstone, to sign a declaration in such wise that you may know whom to trust and whom to suspect." On November 8, 1576, while Antwerp was still burning, nearly all in the States General signed the Pacification of Ghent, in which they agreed to join Holland and Zeeland in their fight against Spain and end the war. The treaty consisted of 25 articles. They agreed, among other things, to abolish the Inquisition and kick the Spanish out of the country, to disband the Council of Troubles, destroy all its verdicts, burn all trial papers, and restore all confiscated properties. To allow Holland and Zeeland their Protestantism, though they weren't allowed to promote their religion in any of the other states. Likewise, the Roman Catholics would not hunt down Protestants in their territories. They confirmed the prince to be the stadholder of Holland and Zeeland and make him a government leader next to the Governor-General. Oh, and they also agreed that Orange's son and heir, Philips Willem, had been illegally abducted by the king's men and should be set free. Though the pacification was more of a provisional agreement, it was the crowning achievement of all of Willem's work. A few days later, the Spanish colonel Cristóbal de Mondragón Talavera de Mercado arrived in Ghent with an army to free his wife, still trapped in the citadel. But he was too late. The Spanish garrison had run out of supplies and handed the citadel to Van den Tempel. Mondragón's wife emerged from the castle unscathed. With the arrival of the new Governor-General, the country calmed down. Don Juan settled in and opened his mail. there was a letter with his brother's instructions. It was a shocker. The king told Don Juan he couldn't make a move until there was a complete, total, and utter pacification of the Netherlands, so that there was no chance, no matter how small, of unrest anywhere. Felipe didn't allow him to take a new place while the old one was still in danger, and before he did anything, Don Juan should first check how willing the English Roman Catholics actually were to rebel against their queen. You see, without help from within, no kingdom could be taken. And by the way, Queen Elizabeth was always looking for men to marry. If she made a move on him, Don Juan should let her, because he might be able to use the wedding as a disguise to invade England. Isn't that a great idea? Am I awesome or what? Signed, your loving brother, Yo El Rey, XOXO. Don Juan was stunned. Felipe had dangled the English crown in front of him just to get him to the Netherlands. His brother didn't support the enterprise of England at all. Yeah, someone should have told him. No one blackmails the King of Spain. Things got better. The States General informed Don Juan that he wasn't allowed to enter the country and wouldn't be installed as the new Governor General for the King. He first had to ratify the pacification of Ghent in the King's name and ditch the Spanish soldiers. Don Juan was baffled. He had to do what now? The States General sent deputies his way to explain, and they brought a list of demands that Don Juan had to sign. A heated negotiation followed. It even turned violent at times. Don Juan kept wanting to throw cups and candlestick holders at the delegates. How dare they treat him, a member of the House of Austria, with such disrespect? The German imperial emissaries kept having to intervene. Prince Willem was extremely suspicious of Don Juan. He knew how those Habsburgers worked. He'd been raised at their court, nothing but lies and deceit. He had Don Juan's intercepted letters to prove it. But few people were willing to listen to the prince, and wouldn't let him raise an army just in case. That would be a violation of the pacification. Besides, those letters were probably fake anyway. To make the pacification of Ghent official across the board, an earlier agreement, the Union of Dordrecht, became the Union of Brussels. Unlike the pacification, this union was not only signed by the States General, but also by the Council of State and all the representatives of Holland and Zeeland. All were united as one man for the fatherland and against the foreign tyranny. All except Luxembourg. Now Friesland, Groningen and the dependencies joined Holland in their rebellion. They kicked out Stadtholder Gaspar de Robles, Señor de Belly, and replaced him with Baron de Ville, the later Count Rennenberg. Don Juan was being a pain in the butt about agreeing to ratify the pacification. Eventually, after the envoys twisted his arm, he promised to maintain the peace concluded between the states and the Prince of Orange. He would hand over the citadels to local rulers, he would restore the state's privileges, and he would remove all the Spanish troops, though the states had to cough up the money to pay their salaries and their journey home so they could be disbanded. There was one caveat. Nothing in the treaty should undermine the king's authority or the Roman Catholic faith. Relieved to get this concession at last, the States General concluded the Eternal Edict with Don Juan on February 12, 1577. On the exact same day Don Juan signed the edict, King Felipe did a 180, because peace. No, not with the Netherlands. The king had concluded a peace with the Ottoman Empire. It freed him up to do some damage. He told his brother to bring in troops from Germany and join them up with the Spanish forces. They should destroy the entire country and their loot would be their pay. Felipe would rather have an obliterated land than lose it while it was still in one piece. Scorched earth or bust. The king's secretary Antonio Pérez and Don Juan's secretary Juan de Escobedo talked him off the ledge. They both wanted to get that enterprise of England underway. Because greed. They warned the king that if he resumed war so close to concluding a peace, he would find all the countries in the world out for his blood. The king had to concede. They were right, though he wished it weren't so. The Netherlands was now utterly pacified and peaceful. There was no chance, no matter how little, of the rebellion flaring up anywhere. The religion and the king's power remained intact, exactly what Felipe had ordered, done and dusted. England, here we come. There was one itty-bitty little problem that Pérez, Escobedo, and Don Juan had all overlooked. King Felipe noticed this fatal flaw right away when he saw the document for the Eternal Edict. You know, I'm missing something here. Where the frack is Willem of Orange's signature, and those of Holland and Zeeland? The The prince and the rebel states had been left out of the edict's negotiations. Only the obedient states had agreed to the deal. The rebel states had not. Oops. Back to the drawing board, boys. The States General had sent Willem the Eternal Edict to ask for his opinion, but they signed the agreement before he could respond. The prince despaired. The edict tore the carefully constructed pacification of Ghent to shreds. Sure, sign it anyway. Orange, speaking on behalf of Holland and Zeeland, responded in an elaborate letter. This was the gist. Have you all gone completely mad? The Reformed religion was not guaranteed in Holland and Zeeland, and these states also had to give up control over their armies. The Inquisition was replaced by an even worse one. And sure, the Spanish soldiers might leave, but what about those 10,000 German mercenaries in Felipe's employ? No, we ain't signing this rag. Yet Don Juan was extremely eager to get Orange on board, so he could go and invade England. So he sent really smart people to the really smart Willem to offer him the world. There was no need for the war anymore. Don Juan had come to forgive and forget and to restore the ancient government. Everything the prince had fought for. He could now lay down his weapons and return the country to peace and the Roman Catholic religion. He promised the prince he'd get his son Philips Willem all his titles and his possessions back. Orange would get a generous pension to live out the rest of his days in comfort. He would receive a pardon, return to his majesty's favor, and be restored in all his honors, so that the future of his house Orange-Nassau was secured. All Willem had to do was hand over his titles and possessions to his son and heir, frack off back to Germany, and never return. However, if the prince continued his rebellion, the king would turn everyone against him and his house would be ruined. The prince calmly told the governor-general that he had done nothing he needed a pardon for. All his titles and properties were already restored to him under the pacification, which, by the way, also provided for the return of his son as per Article 12. Besides, it wasn't his call. The states of Holland and Zeeland were in charge. So Don Juan's representatives met with Orange and representatives of Holland and Zeeland in Geertruidenberg. The meeting was a bust. Holland and Zeeland refused to give up their religion or their control over the military. They wouldn't even recognize Don Juan as their new governor-general. Then, out of the blue, Orange started getting letters from Philips Willem for the first time since the king's men had abducted him to Spain. The 22-year-old wrote his father that he had heard about the peace talks. He was told he'd be going home the moment his father signed the edict. He was super excited and couldn't wait to see his dad again. And say hi to my stepmom Charlotte for me, Dad. So, after nearly 10 years, the king had finally allowed Philips Willem to write letters to his father to get him to sign the edict. That's next level vicious. Don Juan got impatient waiting for Orange to sign off on the edict and entered the country unauthorized, trademark. He attended a festival in Leuven, showed off his mad crossbow skills and won the tournament. The people fell in love with Don Juan, who reminded them of his father, the dashing and engaging Emperor Charles. It's what Felipe was banking on. His brother's natural grace and charm would win the people for him again. The states and Don Juan's secretary, Juan de Escobedo, worked their butts off and got the money together to pay the Spanish troops. They left at the end of April. The states also offered to pay the German soldiers their salary in both money and goods so that they could go as well. But Don Juan didn't want those soldiers going anywhere. He told the German colonels to reject the offer, that the states were plotting to kill them all. He was their only friend. With the Spanish gone, Don Juan could finally enter Brussels. He was all smiles, but he despised the Dutch, referring to them as drunkards, wineskins, and scoundrels. He said the Netherlands was a hell and a Babylon of disgust. Now tell us how you really feel. A few days later, he was sworn in as the new governor-general to rule the Netherlands in Lord Felipe's stead. But he really wanted to get to England now. If the states of Holland and Zeeland only listened to the prince, then he really needed to convince the prince. So, Don Juan sent more envoys to persuade Willem to sign the edict. The prince ran circles around the men. He only had one simple demand: that Don Juan honor all of the pacification, because the Eternal Edict was noticeably lacking. Orange told Don Juan's men, "To tell you the truth, We can see that you wish to exterminate us, and we don't wish to be exterminated. A southern great noble, Philippe de Croix, the Duke of Aarschot, told him that no one intended that. Willem bit back. Indeed, but you do. We have submitted ourselves to you in good faith, and you now would compel us and all the world to maintain exclusively the Catholic religion. This cannot be done, except by exterminating us. Then Orange started making some outrageous demands. It shocked everyone. He insisted that the new Governor-General's foreign advisors left the country. They had to return Utrecht to him and hand over Breda and his goods in Burgundy and Luxembourg. He even said that if they didn't give Utrecht immediately, he would take it himself by force. Why would he do that? Well, his agents had intercepted letters that Don Juan and Escobedo had sent Felipe and Pérez and deciphered them. Don Juan had written the king, "If I keep myself busy, and have kept myself busy with the affairs of England, then the most important reason for that is that I can't see anything more important for the service of your majesty than to return that kingdom to the obedience of the Pope and to entrust it to a person who will serve you, like me." The letters proved that Don Juan was prepared to accept any terms of peace, no matter how outrageous, to clear the way for the enterprise of England. The prince knew that Felipe had forbidden his brother to restart the war, so he could ask for anything he wanted, and the Governor-General would have to give it. Might as well go big or go home, I guess. But Orange made a big mistake here. He hadn't considered that his rival was a disobedient brat. Don Juan was livid with Willem's demands. Just to show who was boss, he issued an edict that heretics would be executed again. In Mechelen, Don Juan attended a beheading of a man accused of having listened to a Protestant sermon. Willem was banging his head against the wall. This is what he'd been warning everyone about. But with the new Governor-General properly installed, the States now told the Prince of Orange to bring over a special someone from Germany. A very up-and-coming person by whom these countries ought to be served well in the times to come. The up-and-comer the States requested had been living with Willem's younger brother, Count Johann von Nassau, at Dillenburg Castle in Germany. It was Graaf Moritz von Nassau, Willem's second son. The States felt that Orange's firstborn, Philips Willem, currently undoubtedly being brainwashed in Spain, was lost to them. Maurits was the prince's heir apparent, and it was high time that he learned about all things Dutch, including the language. They had asked for him 3 years ago, but back then Willem thought Maurits was too young. Now, with the Spanish soldiers gone, I guess the prince felt he could risk it. Count Maurits was 9 years old. He took the 2-week journey to the Netherlands to be reunited with his father. He traveled with his uncle Johann and his cousins, 17-year-old Count Wilhelm Ludwig von Nassau and 10-year-old Count Philip von Nassau. Charlotte de Bourbon, Orange's third wife and mother of their 2 daughters, wanted to unite the entire family and have all the prince's kids in one place. So the 3 daughters from his earlier marriages could also come over. Maurits' half-sister Maria, his older sister Anna, and younger sister Emilia followed soon after. On his way over to Dordrecht, where the prince's family resided at this time, Maurits was made Marquis of Flushing, because, it's what one did back then. Young Maurits did not resemble his father much. He was more like his uncle who had raised him. Johann was a rough and tough guy with sensibilities of the Middle Ages, a strict disciplinarian and a religious heavyweight, much more so than his brother Willem, who had enjoyed the refined taste and glitz and glamour of the Renaissance. Johann was quintessentially German, Teutonic and down-to-earth, no frilly nothing. And so was Maurits, who had a great sense of humor but was quiet, reserved, and a bit wooden. This changed later in life though. There was no party like a Maurits party. We know from the letters that little Maurits wrote to his uncle Johann that he was quite homesick for Dillenburg. Aww. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Holland and Zeeland started to repair their vast system of dikes that they had breached to keep them safe. It was a massive and expensive undertaking, supervised by Orange, who also toured the cities of Holland to shake hands with the enthusiastic crowds. "Father Willem has come! Father Willem has come!" the people shouted, because in the many pamphlets spread over the years, that was what the prince was consistently called, the father of the fatherland. He is still called that today, Vader des Vaderlands. From From the moment Don Juan set foot in the Netherlands, he feared being captured or assassinated. Already in Leuven, 2 Frenchmen had been arrested for plotting to abduct him to France. It turned out not to be true, but Don Juan wasn't so sure. In Brussels, Viscount de Gand had woken him up in the middle of the night. He wasn't safe in that town. So the Governor-General fled to Mechelen. But after attending the execution of the heretic, he felt unsafe there as well. He was sure the prince was behind it all. The Duke of Aarschot had snitched to Don Juan that Orange had secretly recommended the States to capture the king's brother on his arrival. Orange wasn't gonna hurt him though. He wanted to use Don Juan as a hostage to extort terms from Felipe. You got my son, I got your brother. Let's tango. Olé! Nothing came of it. Just so you know, the Duke of Aarschot was also snitching Don Juan's plans to Willem. As a result, neither side trusted him. Don Juan started seeing armed soldiers behind every tree and believed traps were laid for him in every street. He begged Felipe to recall him. He wouldn't last another week. He said, "The people here are bewitched by the Prince of Orange. They love him, they fear him, and wish to have him for their master. They tell him everything and make no decision without consulting him." When he found out that King Henri of Navarre's wife, Queen Marguerite, was headed to Spa to drink the waters, Don Juan rode out to meet her in Namur. It was a Governor-General thing to do, but he was there for another reason entirely, and so was she. And no, get your mind out of the gutter, it wasn't that. He used the opportunity to leave Mechelen and retreat to a safe place. Don Juan must have been really wrapped up in his own worries because he didn't realize that Marguerite was healthy as an ox. She didn't need spa water. What was she really doing there? We'll get to that. The moment the queen left, Don Juan made a beeline for the Namur citadel, where he had breakfast with Governor Seigneur de Froidmont. Suddenly, Don Juan jumped up from the table, drew his sword, and told the governor to surrender the citadel to him. At the same time, his men, who had been hiding outside in the bushes all this time, swarmed the hall. Froidmont was like, "Dude, why the drama? The place is already yours because you're like the boss of us, but whatevs." He left with his garrison as Don Juan established his own. He called it his first day of government. In taking the citadel by force, he kind of declared war on the Netherlands again and sent orders to the Tercios in Italy to stand by. King Felipe was like, "Could you not?" His first response to his brother's unauthorized acts, trademark, was to send express messengers to Italy to forbid anyone from following Don Juan's orders. "Don't do this. I don't want the Dutch to see Spanish troops and bankers coming, because of the fear and mistrust this would cause." Felipe dictated a bitter reprimand for his brother. "We shouldn't station foreign troops in the Netherlands because the irrefutable proof of the past shows this doesn't work. That's why I will decide what is best in the light of the affairs of my kingdom and the means and the funds that are available to me." The States General went to Namur to make peace with Don Juan, but he had it with these guys and told them to give in to his every demand. They should remove Protestants from government and fight the Prince of Orange and give me some bodyguards. You better do it, because I've also taken the Antwerp citadel. The States General responded. They gave him bodyguards, no problem, but as to everything else, nope. And what was that about the Antwerp citadel? Don Juan had appointed the Duke of Aarschot as the commander of the Antwerp citadel, but he never trusted him. So, when he went to Namur, he took the Duke with him and left the royalist Seigneur de Treslong in charge. The Governor-General then sent secret orders to Colonel Van Ende to join up with the German forces already in the city and together take the citadel and the town. But the magistry in Antwerp wasn't born yesterday. They remembered Van Ende from the Antwerp Fury. They denied him access to the town and sicked Governor Frédéric de Perrenot, Lord of Champagne, on them. A citadel garrison officer, Captain de Boer, got some money from the city's merchants to bribe the Spanish garrison, and after fighting the one company still loyal to Treslong, he captured the men. The citadel now belonged to the beggars, but they still had those German mercenaries in the city. The Germans feared an attack and barricaded themselves in the town and started to negotiate for their pay. The merchants pulled together 300,000 crowns for their salary so they would leave, but initially offered them only 150,000. You know the Dutch, always looking for a bargain. The negotiators went back and forth, but as night set in, the Germans saw sails appearing in the harbor. It was a squadron of the prince's ships. They'd been on their way to Tolen, but when they heard rumors about what was happening in Antwerp, they decided to check it out. Now the citizens shouted, "The beggars are coming!" The Germans freaked out. The sea beggars were absolutely terrifying, so they ran, leaving everything behind, including their pay. One company of Germans hid in Bergen-op-Zoom, where Champagny immediately besieged them. These soldiers surrendered quickly. Another group went to Breda and also came under siege. They held out for 2 months, waiting for Don Juan to relieve them. They surrendered when they received a message from the Governor-General that he was under siege himself and couldn't help them. They had been given a clever forgery of an intercepted coded letter. In the real message, Don Juan had told the Germans that he was on his way to relieve them. The prince, aka the Baron of Breda, tricked the men into getting his city back. For years, the prince had begged in vain for the towns to dismantle their evil citadels. But after this incident, Antwerp's citizens took matters into their own hands and worked day and night to tear their citadel down. In the basement, they found Alba's bronze statue, forged from the captured rebel cannons at Jemmingen. The late Governor-General Requesens had stashed it there when he arrived. They dragged it out in the streets and hacked it to pieces. Some chunks were taken home as souvenirs, but most of it was smelted back into cannons. Full circle. Other towns followed Antwerp's lead and dismantled their citadels. When Don Juan heard he hadn't captured Antwerp, he was fuming. Thankless jerks! Had he not done all he ever promised? Had he not discharged the Spaniards, placed the citadels in the hands of locals, restored the privileges, and submitted to insults and obscenities? He only wanted peace. But the states were like, you keep using that word. We do not think it means what you think it means. Sure, he had dismissed the Spaniards, but used the Germans against them. He tried to take back the citadels, and he was obviously gathering troops. And those insults? Yeah, that's all Willem, sorry. But Don Juan refused to stand down, not while Orange was still armed. The states simply stopped listening to the Governor-General. The prince had just given him a stack of intercepted letters revealing Don Juan to be a double-dealing, lying SOB. I should point out that these contained fake instructions written by Felipe's secretary Antonio Pérez to trick Don Juan into committing treasonous acts. More about that later. The states told King Felipe to send a replacement, and this time send a royal who wasn't a bastard, please. In the meantime, they made a peace deal with Don Juan. Then they asked Orange to come to Brussels. They needed to pick his brain. Willem returned to Brussels for the first time in 10 years on September 13, 1577. For miles outside the city, enthusiastic crowds lined the road to greet the prince and his huge entourage, welcoming Willem as their savior. Men were on their knees, women were weeping. It was the proudest day of the prince's life. When Don Juan heard that Orange had been welcomed in Brussels like a messiah, he feared the worst. Sure enough, Willem immediately put a stop to the new peace deal the Governor-General had just made with the States General. He added some new demands instead. Most importantly, Don Juan had to leave Namur Castle, retire to Luxembourg, sit there, shut up, and obey all the Council of State's decisions. Don Juan was humiliated, but still obeying Felipe's orders, he agreed to each of the demands. But the more he agreed to, the more people suspected him of foul play. They weren't wrong. Don Juan didn't believe he had to keep his word to heretics. Then Felipe did a 180 concerning Don Juan's rash and unauthorized acts, trademark. The king told his troops in Italy to stand by and called together the entire Consejo de Estado, the Spanish State Council, to discuss the current situation in the Netherlands. Cardinal Gaspar Quiroga pleaded that now was the time to execute the Enterprise of England scheme instead. Once England was in Spanish hands, taking the Netherlands back would be easy from there. But the rest of the Spanish council advised the king to resume hostilities in the Netherlands immediately. This take England, then take the Netherlands idea would come back around again in a few years, something involving an armada. You may have heard of it. Felipe extended the peace with the Ottomans to prevent any distractions. He then signed the orders to send the tercios back to the Low Countries. When Queen Elizabeth found out the war was back on, she sent £100,000 and John Norris with volunteer troops to support the states. Willem had told her all about the Enterprise of England. It was best for her that Don Juan was kept busy over there. When Don Juan received the news that Felipe had decided to send the troops back in and resume the war, the hero of Lepanto was hallelujahing around the house. After 6 months of peace, the war's back on, baby. was not all peace and love and good happiness stuff for Willem in Brussels. Willem's bitter rival, the Duke of Aarschot, had welcomed the prince with open arms. However, behind his back, the Duke and other Roman Catholic grandees had contacted the Archduke of Austria, Matthias de Austria, King Felipe's nephew and brother-in-law. Though the Roman Catholic nobles no longer recognized Don Juan as Governor-General, they wanted to break Orange's power over the Netherlands. They didn't like him, his religious tolerance, his democratic principles, nor the Dutch-speaking people at all. The group asked the 20-year-old to come to the Netherlands and preserve the country for the Habsburg dynasty and the Roman Catholic faith. And for some reason, he agreed. Matthias had no experience, no power, no wealth, and no permission from his brother, the Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf had succeeded their father, Emperor Maximilian, who had died the year before. They had to smuggle the young man out of the country, dressed as a servant. When Don Juan found out that the Dutch had ditched him, he was beside himself with rage. The Queen of England was furious, the King of Spain was incensed, but the Prince of Orange was chill, despite the whole thing being a plot to undermine him. Orange planned to squash this lemon into lemonade, and His Excellency gave His Royal Highness Matthias a grand and super warm welcome in Brussels. It's not like Willem had a choice. Had he not welcomed him, the Emperor would have been mad. Had he left, his rivals would have won. The prince neutralized everyone by staying. And the inexperienced Matthias was putty in Willem's highly experienced hands. The Archduke was more interested in playing dress-up as a Roman ruler than actually ruling anyway. Matthias had to agree to far less powers than any governor before him. The States General ruled, and the Governor-General had to obey them and the Council of State. The prince had a lot of influence on the government and over Matthias. The man was soon called the Scribe of Willem. The young and naive Governor-General for the rebel state simply signed the documents that the prince put in front of him. Willem also had everyone sign a second union of Brussels, making the Reformed religion equal to the Roman Catholic religion. But Holland and Zeeland were being difficult again. They refused to play ball with this new Governor-General and no longer paid war contributions. Orange had little influence on this. He wasn't in those states. Now that the war was back on, Felipe had a problem with Don Felipe Guillermo de Nassau, or the Count of Buren as the king called him. He had allowed Philips Willem to make contact with his father to get him to give up the war. It hadn't worked, and now the king worried that the family used the correspondence to plot to break him out. So, on December 7th, 1577, 2 weeks before the young man's 23rd birthday, the king finally dropped the facade that Orange's son and heir wasn't his prisoner and locked him up at the castle of Arevalo. His chambers at the somber keep were fit for a royal, but Philips Willem was now truly a prisoner. Another de facto prisoner, Anna of Saxony, Willem's second wife, died from exhaustion and liver failure on December 18, 1577, 2 weeks shy of her 32nd birthday. Oh joy, oh joy! The Spanish silver fleet arrived from the Americas with the greatest haul ever! The king could now pay off his creditors and secure a 5 million ducat loan for Don Juan's war expenses. A few months later, Queen Anna gave birth to a son, Felipe, on April 3, 1578. King Felipe had an heir again. Finally, things were looking up. The war was back on in the Netherlands. You didn't think it was over yet, did you? It's called the 80 Years' War for a reason, and we're only 10 years in. Roermond and Vredenburg Castle were besieged by rebel troops commanded by Count Philip von Hohenlohe and the Count of Boussu, respectively. The former stadtholder for the king had been imprisoned by the rebels after the Zuiderzee battle, but he had been released under the terms of the pacification of Ghent, just like Philip's Marnix Lord of St. Aldegonde had been set free. He had to promise, though, to only fight for the fatherland this time, and he did. Apparently, being left to rot in a rebel prison wasn't good for employer-employee relations. Don Juan quickly gathered an army of 20,000 well-seasoned and disciplined veterans. They gathered in Luxembourg, and it was a veritable who's who of the mighty Spanish army. Bringing troops from France were General Peter Ernst Graaf von Mansfeld-Vodeoord and his son Karel. Colonel Mondragon, General Bernardino de Mendoza, and General Alessandro Farnese arrived with troops from Italy and Spain. Farnese, Don Juan's nephew and old schoolmate, was shocked to see his uncle weakened and worn, a shadow of his former self. Rebel side, things were a bit awkward. The prince's 20,000 troops were under the command of Roman Catholic great nobles who didn't like Willem, didn't like the Holland Rebellion, and didn't like the creepy Calvinists. But they also didn't like Don Juan, so good enough. On the last day of January, the prince's army marched on the city of Namur, where Don Juan was held up. They planned to besiege the citadel, but when they heard that the governor-general would take to the field himself, they headed for Gembloux, 9 miles from the town. Don Juan tracked them under the crucifix emblazoned banner, Inoc signo vici Turcos, inoc hereticos vincem. In this sign I conquered the Turks, in this sign I shall conquer the heretics. Mansfeld and Mondragon attacked the rear of the rebel forces, but Farnese noticed that as the army moved along the edges of a deep ravine beside a swampy river, their pikes were waving. The soldiers' footing was unsteady. Perfetto. Tell Don Juan of Austria that Alessandro of Parma has plunged into the abyss, to perish there or to come forth again victorious. Alessandro mounted a stronger horse and waded through the bog with his men to attack the rebel army in its flank. When the prince's soldiers saw Farnese's troops coming like some kind of swamp thing, there was instant chaos. The commanders couldn't get anyone to stand, and the whole army was broken up in no time. The cavalry ran, trampling their own, and left the center exposed. Farnese went in for the kill. 90 minutes later, nearly all of the prince's mercenaries were dead. The hundreds of prisoners of war were later killed in Namur, either by being thrown off the city walls, drowned in the river, or hanged. None were left alive, because heretics. The Spanish casualties were minimal, about 12 dead and a few wounded. In Brussels, this massive loss enraged the people. They accused the Roman Catholic nobles not only of incompetence, but of treason. Orange had to go door to door to try to calm everyone down. Don Juan still got it as the savior of the Christian world. He would now unleash his Spanish wrath on the people and take back the country for the king. Though Don Juan was now broke, he headed for Brussels, closing in on the prince and Matthias. Willem persuaded the States General and Governor-General to follow him as he fell back to Antwerp. In a matter of weeks, Don Juan swept up a whole bunch of towns, killing anyone who so much as looked at him the wrong way. The southern nobles, clergy, and patricians got scared when they saw the governor-general coming for them. They began to resent the Holland Rebellion, which was going to cost them dearly, while Holland, practically Spanish-free since '74, felt nothing. Don Juan's victories weren't grand. All he got were second-rate towns that were already loyal to the king. None of them even came close to the importance of a city like Amsterdam, for instance. Speaking of which... The powerful and wealthy town of Amsterdam was a Roman Catholic enclave in Holland. The city was predominantly Protestant, but it was brimming with monks, and all the city leaders were Roman Catholic, pro-king and anti-prince. The town was a huge weak spot in Holland's defenses. Don Juan was already considering launching a campaign from there. Something had to be done. The prince started negotiating with the city for satisfaction. It was a treaty of compromise to secure Amsterdam's support for the rebellion, to accept Willem as their stadtholder, while he allowed them to remain Roman Catholics. But the magistrates didn't want to submit their authority to the prince. Meanwhile, the citizens of Holland were itching to take Amsterdam by force. In October 1577, Willem decreed that no one was allowed to make a move on Amsterdam. Holland reluctantly lifted the very effective naval blockade that would have starved the city into submission, but in secret they kept plotting to annex the town. A month later, Colonel Helling tried and failed to carry the city by surprise. He was killed in action. The prince was like, "Guys, seriously? I'm trying to get a treaty done here." Goes, Tolen, and Haarlem had already accepted their satisfaction deal. When Utrecht followed that fall, they successfully persuaded Amsterdam to join their sister city. The Satisfaction Treaty put the Roman Catholic religion first in Amsterdam, but allowed for Reformed religion in certain places. Protestants were also allowed to bury their dead in the city cemeteries, as long as the funerals were modest, and no more than 24 people were in attendance. Amsterdam joining Holland more than made up for the losses after Gembloux. You didn't think it would end there, did ya? As I said, the majority of the people in Amsterdam were Protestant or other. Still, they weren't represented in government, felt unsafe around the Roman Catholic Civil Guard, and hated the crappy funeral deal. A few months later, Willem Bardes, the son of a former high sheriff and pro-prince, orchestrated a coup. With the help of the prince's governor for the northern quarter, Dietrich Sonoy, his soldiers, and armed citizens, Bardez rounded up the friars and magistrates. He shipped them out of the city, dropped them off on a dike, and told them they could never ever return. The city council members were replaced with Protestants, and for a while the Roman Catholics could not worship in Amsterdam. This had been a bloodless coup. The next day, the same thing happened in Haarlem, but there was some bloodshed here for which the perpetrator was executed, and for a time Roman Catholics couldn't worship there either. This went against everything that had been agreed, and Willem was like, "Are you kidding me right now?" Some blamed Willem for this alteration of Amsterdam. He hadn't instigated it, but he had been arrogant. When the States General had appointed Willem as a government leader, they had agreed to his religious tolerance policy, but the citizens hadn't. He thought everyone would just hold hands and sing Kumbaya when no one wanted that. Roman Catholics and Protestants did not tolerate each other, no matter how much he willed them to. He had the same problem with his democratic ideas of empowering the middle class and giving everyone a vote. This concept was way too foreign to a people who put blind faith in divinely appointed rulers. They liked him as a person, but his ideas, not so much. The Prince of Orange was trying to keep all 17 states united. His policies were contradictory. In the northern states, he was pressured to ban Roman Catholic services, but in the south, he fought to keep these services. The north and the south were simply too different. The northern states were independent and cohesive. They mistrusted the Brussels government and hated the scattered and leaderless southern states and their embittered and selfish elites. They only used the war to force King Felipe to make concessions that benefited them. The southern Roman Catholics, on the other hand, were very dedicated to their faith and also a bit superstitious. They also truly felt that the Protestants were dangerous heretics. The southern elite hated Don Juan and the Spanish occupation, so they automatically sided with the rebellion. But they also hated the rebellion and wanted to keep the Roman Catholic faith and reconcile with the king. The Roman Catholic great nobles now pressured Matthias to instate one of their own, George van Lalaing, the Count of Rennenberg, as the stadholder of Friesland, Drenthe, Groningen and Overijssel. They hoped to increase Roman Catholic power in the north and told Rennenberg to purge these states from the rebels who tried to get rid of the royalists. But the citizens up north didn't want Brussels to tell them what to do. They refused to submit to any kind of centralized authority, especially from them southerners. They in turn forced Count Rennenberg to fire all government members still loyal to the king. The Roman Catholic Church took a nosedive. After the pacification of Ghent, the Calvinists not only returned to the northern states, but also to some major southern cities in droves. They felt it was payback time for the years they had lived in oppression. The city of Ghent was a particular target. In February 1578, a Calvinist coup rocked that city. They arrested the stadholder for Flanders, the Duke of Aarschot, for trying to strike a deal with Don Juan. They also hanged a former Blood Council judge. Willem didn't dare stop the raging men who wanted to create a Calvinist republic and take over Flanders. He did tell the men to release Aarschot, which they did. The whole situation devolved into a chaos that no one could control. While Don Juan was unleashing his rage on the southern states, the radical Calvinists took Oudenaarde, Kortrijk, Utrecht and Bruges. They got rid of all the Roman Catholic rulers there. See, the union was a sham. The Roman Catholic nobles turned their back on the prince en masse, surrendered to Don Juan, and returned to the king. The division in the Low Countries got worse. Bossu and his friend Gilles de Berlaymont, Lord of Hierges, captured Castle Vredenburg in Utrecht. The two great nobles were on the rebel side because they fought against Team Don Juan, but neither were on Team Prince. They were actually pretty mad at him. Bossu and Hierges had both been in the running for the stadholders of Utrecht. They had both lost to Willem. The prince had pressured the council by telling them that unless they picked him, he would not protect them once the Spanish came a-knocking. After this, Hierges switched to Team Don Juan. The Governor-General told him to take Zieghem, a property of the Prince of Orange. Hierges failed to take the town, but after Farnese joined the Count and ordered a storm, the place surrendered. Most rebels were hanged from the castle so everyone could see them. The rest of the garrison had their heads bashed in with a hammer and their bodies were thrown into the river Damer. The stadholderate for Gelderland was also up for grabs. Bossu and Orange were candidates. Holland and Zeeland feared the Spanish advancing on Gelderland and wanted Willem in charge, but the state didn't want the prince to take over everything. They also realized they couldn't have a Roman Catholic stadholder because the Roman Church was so weak in the state. They went Lutheran and chose Johan van Nassau, Willem's younger brother, to become Gelderland stadholder. But surprise! Johan had recently switched to Calvinism, and he was only willing to pledge loyalty to the states, not the king. Oops. Egged on by the locals, Johan started the Reformation in Gelderland. He got rid of all of the Grand Duke of Alba's appointees. Regents were forced to open the churches for the Protestant services, and a new iconoclastic fury broke out. It took a few months, but by January, all city governments in Gelderland had been purged of royalists. The end result? No Roman Catholics held a government position in the north anymore. The States General in Brussels couldn't do anything about it. The Prince of Orange needed to get his troops in order. He collected money in the states through previously agreed upon contributions, but he also raised the taxes. Wait, hadn't this thing gone down because of the new taxes former Governor General Alba had imposed? Yep. In Holland and Zeeland, the contributions were kept voluntary, but these citizens volunteered more money than would have been collected through taxes. Willem also received money and soldiers from Queen Elizabeth, and she paid for the troops of Duke Johan Casimir to come from the Palatinate in Germany. Johan Casimir was not a gifted commander, and he was only interested in the prestige of fighting in a noble war. The Duke wanted to show Alba that he was wrong in saying that the German potentates carried plenty of lions, dragons, eagles, and griffins on their shields, but that these ferocious animals were not given to biting or scratching. Johan Casimir would show everyone that the teeth and claws of German princes were still dangerous. Orange didn't care for him, and kept a close eye on this ambitious young man who was probably going to be more trouble than he was worth. Troops were quickly enrolled. But someone hadn't learned their lesson. The Roman Catholic great nobles were once again made commanders of the prince's army. On the royal side, Don Juan wasn't doing well. He had fallen ill and had to stay in Namur to recover. Johan Casimir's army was expected to arrive in the Netherlands any moment now. The most direct route was through Limburg. The Governor-General ordered Farnese to secure that state, to block his path. After Alessandro's men captured Dolheim, Farnese himself arrived to besiege the city of Limburg. The citizens begged for more time, but after a while Farnese believed the people were stalling and opened up the cannons. A breach was made. The general was about to order a storm when the citizens again asked for a moment. Farnese silenced the cannons but threatened there would be a terrible massacre if they were playing him. They weren't. When an officer went over to the breach to parley, he found women and children on their knees begging for forgiveness. The town surrendered. Of the rebel garrison, 1,000 men then joined the royal army. That same day, more places fell into Farnese's hands, and he moved on Dahlem. The town's garrison of a whopping 250 resisted so much that Alessandro had to take the city by storm. But the castle walls were tough, and the soldiers defending the town were even tougher. Even after the royal troops made a breach in the city walls, the garrison sortied and killed many Spaniards. Farnese fought back hard and captured the place. He then ordered the massacre of all the men, women, and even children who had fled into the church. Farnese earned himself a nickname here: Second Alba. But, save for the city of Maastricht, the state of Limburg was recovered for the king. Johan Casimir's arrival was now delayed because he had to take a detour to enter the Netherlands. Meanwhile, up north, the state's troops under Count Rennenberg took Kampen with the help of the sea beggars firing at the place from the water. Rennenberg then besieged Deventer, which surrendered to the rebels 3 months later. In the south, the rebel and royal armies stood facing each other. Don Juan had 30,000 troops. The rebels under Count Bossu had 12,000 foot and 7,000 horse. They were waiting for Johan Casimir and his 12,000. The Germans were still camped out in Zutphen, waiting for their salaries. Don Juan figured he'd take on the rebels before the Duke got there. Farnese said, "Dude, don't do it." Yet the Governor-General crossed the River Damer near Aarschot and fought his way forward, till he got to Rijmenam, near Mechelen. There, early in the morning, on August 1st, 1578, Don Juan's army attacked, hoping to lure Bossu into an open field battle. Bossu didn't move. After waiting for 3 hours, Don Juan sent musketeers and cuirassiers forward to fake charge at the rear of the village. Bossu sent the English commander John Norris to handle it. Then the Scottish troops got involved, and then more Spaniards joined in. At the same time, Farnese moved in with his men. Norris was driven back to the village. He set some houses on fire and prepared to counter, but the Spaniards saw the burning houses and thought that Bossu had ordered the retreat. They entered the town, but the Count opened up the cannons on them and the Scots attacked. Farnese saw where this was headed and retreated. Bossu didn't give chase. The next morning he was asked to do double or nothing, but he refused. The Count believed the general engagement would cause too many losses, as always happened in these situations. Of course, people suspected him of double-crossing. The Calvinists plundered the town of Aarschot, and the Spanish took revenge, plundering it for 4 more days, and then burned it to the ground. Because war. Don Juan's rash assault had cost thousands of his men's lives. He lost almost all the territory he had gained after Gembloux. But Don Juan was getting scared of his brother. On March 31st, 1578, former secretary of King Felipe and current secretary of Don Juan at the Spanish court, Juan de Escobedo, was hacked to death in the streets of Madrid. People rushed to the secretary's aid, but the 6 murderers got away. Murders like this were uncommon, and it was more unusual that no one was caught. In fact, all killers left the country and were rewarded for their attack. The king's secretary Antonio Pérez had plotted to remove Escobedo from the earth. Felipe sanctioned it, but he wouldn't admit to that until 11 years later. Pérez had told the king that Escobedo was key to a plot to remove Felipe from power. He said that the secretary and Don Juan had plotted to leave the Netherlands and take over the throne not only of England but also of Spain. They would ban the king from the country. Don Juan had specifically asked Alba for Alessandro Farnese to come to the Netherlands so he could go to Spain in case something happened to His Majesty. He could then take the king's place. "That's an attempted coup if I ever saw one," Pérez told the king. Felipe couldn't arrest the man, because his brother would then know that the king knew about his plot. Murder it was. While Pérez tried to get Don Juan to admit to treason, remember those letters with the fake instructions? It was decided that the secretary should be removed by darle un bocado o cosa tal, give him a taste of something. They tried and failed to poison him 3 times. They gave up on a subtle death, and Escobedo was murdered in the streets. But there is no hard evidence that Escobedo or Don Juan wanted to overthrow the king. It appears that Pérez made this up and convinced the king that Escobedo and Don Juan were traitors. Perhaps Escobedo knew of some of Pérez's career-ending secrets and needed to be silenced. We don't know. As Felipe feared, Don Juan definitely suspected his half-brother was behind it all. He was sure the king would order his death next. The Roman Catholic nobles in the Netherlands were really fed up with the Prince of Orange having complete control over his scribe, Matthias. But because the king was a tyrant who refused to listen to his loyal subjects, they would find another, more decent sovereign to rule them. He had to be big and powerful to scare the King of Spain, at least a little bit. So, to break Willem's power, they contacted François, the Duke of Anjou and Alençon, the brother of King Henri III of France. The 23-year-old had a terrible reputation and was hated by Roman Catholics, Lutherans and Huguenots alike, and yet still better than Willem. They were unaware that the prince had already been negotiating with Anjou. Remember Queen Marguerite taking the waters at Spa despite her excellent health? She had actually gone there to meet up with Willem to discuss terms for her brother's rule. Orange had kept the Duke in reserve to guide the Netherlands through the immense labyrinth of political intrigue in Europe. For instance, the mere threat of Anjou's appointment as a sovereign ruler of the Netherlands kept Queen Elizabeth in check. She didn't want the French to rule the Low Countries and given the Dutch her support to prevent his appointment. But now the Roman Catholics had forced Willem's hand and invited the Duke over. Anjou arrived in Mons in July 1578 to hammer out a deal to become the next Governor-General of the Netherlands, possibly more. Willem was all over it. He drew up the agreement, which was a list of a whole bunch of don'ts and one do. Anjou had to defend the Netherlands against the tyranny of Spain. The Duke signed the preliminary agreement in August 1578 and could now call himself defender of the liberty of the Netherlands against the tyranny of the Spaniards and their adherents. An empty title because he still had to obey the the government of the country, but Anjou was flattered. Once again, Willem neutralized his rivals and was sipping his lemonade. But Anjou was no Matthias, and got busy figuring out how to circumvent the agreement to increase his power. And poor Matthias burst into tears when he found out that he was being ditched. The French king publicly denounced Anjou's appointment. Henri didn't want to piss off Felipe, who was definitely pissed off. But he must have known about it, since their mother Catherine de' Medici had orchestrated the whole thing. The Queen Mother believed in Nostradamus' prediction. She would be the mother of 4 kings. 3 had already been crowned. Anjou would be the 4th. The Queen of England was also angry and now threatened to withdraw her support. Elizabeth even considered sending an army to fight the Dutch for allowing Anjou to even set foot in the country. But Anjou wasn't Governor-General just yet. Don Juan and the royal army lay in a fortified camp at Bouge. The Governor-General-elect's French army was camped out at Mons, and the rebel army under Boussu and Johan Casimir were dug in at Mechelen. No one moved. No one had money to move. Anjou had issued a violent war declaration against Don Juan, but had yet to do anything about it. He tried and failed to take Mons for himself, but in September Anjou decided to take back Binche, so his soldiers could plunder it for pay. In the meantime, Boussu and Johan Casimir realized the Spanish were MIA and marched on Nivelles and Chimay. Why were the royal troops missing in action? Well, Don Juan was sick as a dog, suffering from typhoid fever while the plague raged through his army. Don Juan needed to move, or else his supply lines would be cut off, but he was stuck. He begged his brother to recall him. He would die if he stayed in the Low Countries a day longer. But Felipe kept sending his brother letters complaining that he wasn't moving fast enough to recover the country for king and god. Apparently, he believed that words win wars because Felipe wasn't sending any money. Anjou could gain a foothold in Hainaut. If that happened, Don Juan feared that the King of France would come in from Burgundy and do a quick land grab for himself. Don Juan begged his brother for instructions. Should he go to Burgundy to stop the French king? Wait for relief? Or should he fight, and if so, with whom? He wanted to do whatever His Majesty asked, but he needed an answer. He got nothing. In fact, the king scribbled in the margins of one of his brother's letters, "There is no point in answering him." Don Juan wrote him, "Thus I remain, perplexed and confused, desiring more than life some decision on your Majesty's part, for which I have implored so many times." The savior of the Christian world was desperate to leave, but it was the Lord Almighty who called him home. Don Juan passed away October 1st, 1578, aged 31. Thank you. Next. Naturally, people suspected he was murdered. 2 innocent Englishmen were even arrested and executed for it. Most believe this was done to draw attention away from the real culprit, the king, but Felipe's murder plot remains unproven. It had been Don Juan's dying request that he would be buried in El Escorial next to his imperial father. King Felipe granted his wish, but the cheapskate didn't want to give his half-brother an expensive royal journey home. So his body was cut up into 3 parts, packed in 3 bags, and hung from 3 different horses. Once, at El Escorial Monasterial Palace, his body was reattached with wire, dressed up, and presented to the king. It was said Felipe recoiled at the hideous sight of the reassembled body. Don Juan de Austria was then buried beside his dad, Charles V. A few months later, Boussu died. People suspected the prince had killed him by poisoning his oysters, and Orange had stood over his bed to mock the Catholic death rites. This didn't happen. Willem had recently granted the count a yearly salary, and in a private letter he lamented the loss of the brave soldier. King Felipe also granted Don Juan's second deathbed wish. He wanted their nephew, Alessandro Farnese, to be put in charge as the new Governor-General. In November, Felipe let Farnese know, "Tag, you're it, officially." At least Farnese was royal blood, and unlike both his parents, he wasn't a bastard. And he was of a completely different class than Alba, Requesens, and Don Juan. This guy was smart. A few weeks into the siege of Binche, the French took the city by storm, killing anyone who was armed. The soldiers were disappointed that there wasn't much to plunder. They robbed the church instead. Then they got caught up in the plague that swept through the region. Anjou still hadn't been made governor-general and felt he wasn't getting anywhere with the Dutch. He disbanded his troops and returned to France. Several thousand of his mercenaries joined a group of mutinous Walloons called the Malcontents, or Paternoster-Jacks, as the Calvinists named them. The Malcontents, led by Emmanuel Philibert of Lalaing, the Lord of Montigny, had split off from the state's army a week earlier because they were unhappy with their lack of pay, the forced religious peace, and Ghent's scrappy attitude toward the Roman Catholics. The malcontents captured Menen, declared war on the state's army and on Flanders, and started raiding the Flemish countryside. So, it was technically a civil war now. Now the southern Netherlands was swarming with hordes of malcontents. They were plundering and abusing people supposedly to protect the clergy. Meanwhile, the Calvinists in Ghent were plundering and abusing the clergy supposedly to protect their freedom. The prince made everyone in the city sign a treaty to stop the abuse of the Roman Catholics. But the Protestant extremists were not interested in religious peace. After raiding a ton of churches, they kicked the Roman Catholics out of the town. The prince was outraged. Destruction of church property was punishable by death. He'd seen to that. Like Martin Luther, he believed that once idol worship was removed from the heart, the statues in the churches would inevitably topple over. He gave up. Clearly, his religious tolerance policy was not wanted. He quit. But both the Calvinists and the Roman Catholics were like, "No, don't go, please don't leave us, we need you." They asked Willem to go to Ghent in person. His very presence would calm everyone down. Of course, those who hated him could easily ambush and kill him there, so your call. The prince decided to go to Ghent, calmed everyone down, and signed another religious peace. The malcontents were told to lay down their weapons, but they refused. They wanted the reformed religion gone. The hardcore Calvinists wanted the Roman Catholic religion gone. This was going swimmingly. In the meantime, the only one going anywhere was Johann Casimir. He took his troops and left the Netherlands. General Alessandro Farnese was the king's new governor-general in town, and oh boy, was he on a whole nother level than his predecessors. This guy was brilliant. The 33-year-old was a people person, and hella charming. I mean, he was Italian. Farnese was an excellent military strategist who actually had control over his troops. He brought discipline and order, took care of his men, and paid them on time. He knew violence was sometimes necessary, but he preferred the diplomatic route. The general mastered the art of bribery and had Sneak 100. He could buy anyone and anything for a reasonable price, without anyone finding out about it until after it was done. In deepest secret, the Governor-General smooth-talked many people and eventually entire states into switching to the king's side. He convinced the fierce Roman Catholic nobles, the fierce malcontents, and regular Roman Catholics who just didn't like the Calvinists that the grass was greener on the Spanish side. And they had cookies. They would all soon find out that the king's cookies were hard to digest, and the greener pastures were actually in the rebel states, who were about to enter the Golden Age. The first state to fall for Alessandro's charms was Artois. They were unable to pay the war contributions to the rebels. When Willem suggested that then they should tax the clergy, they were done. The king would treat him much better than the prince ever would. Artois, Hainaut, Lille, Douai, and Orchy created a new union loosely based on the pacification of Ghent. Except the Roman Catholic faith was made exclusive, and they swore absolute loyalty to the King of Spain. The union was dubbed the Peace of Utrecht, but essentially it was a declaration of war on the northern states. It was official. The rebellion was now a civil war. In return for their loyalty, Farnese promised the states he would maintain their ancient privileges, appoint local rulers only, remove foreign interference in local business, return to the state of 1564, and remove the Spanish troops from their territories. Promise. Hand on heart. Since the removal of the Spanish troops was the whole reason for the pacification in the first place, the states were happy. At last. Eventually, this group was reunited with those already on the king's side, Namur, Luxembourg, and Limburg. These southerners preferred to be maltreated by the king than to be bossed around by a heretic. Meanwhile, Farnese must have regretted bringing up the year 1564. It had been the year the great nobles had managed to get Cardinal Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle kicked out of the country. He had given King Felipe an idea. Felipe decided to bring back the former Governors-General Margareta. Then everyone would think that things were back to normal. Alessandro was like, "Mom, I'm in charge now. Shoot!" He successfully pleaded his case with King Felipe, who got rid of Farnese's mom again. The Governor-General told the northern states to also sign the Union of Utrecht or else. The rebel states did no such thing. 2 weeks after the Union of Utrecht, the northern states announced their own union, the Union of Utrecht, crafted the year before by Johan van Nassau, rebel stadtholder of Gelderland and brother of Prince Willem. Lawyer Johan van Oldenbarneveld helped draft it. The prince didn't think this union was far-reaching enough. He wanted a total unity of the country. But despite presenting a united military front, the independent states wanted to keep their independence. That's why they started fighting in the first place. In May 1579, Willem reluctantly signed the union. The prince felt defeated. His carefully constructed pacification of Ghent had collapsed since no one wanted religious peace. There were still representatives in the southern States General who thought, we can turn this around and unite all the 17 states again. They accepted an invitation from Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor, to attend a peace conference in Köln. The war raged on. Farnese's army started randomly attacking towns all over the place. He kept everyone guessing as to what his end goal was. They had no money for it, but the rebels now had to put garrisons in towns everywhere, which was exactly what Farnese wanted them to do. On March 2nd, 1579, the Governor-General showed up at Antwerp. 3,000 Scottish and English troops fought the Spanish. They were pushed back all the way to under the city walls. The Prince of Orange and the Archduke Matthias stood on the fortifications, directing the soldiers. 2 hours later, after General Farnese had lost 400 men, he suddenly retreated and disappeared. Willem warned everyone that Farnese was close to making his big move. Sure enough, 10 days later, the general unexpectedly showed up in Maastricht, on the other side of the country. He besieged the place with 20,000 men. After 6,000 cannonballs failed to make a dent in the walls, the royal troops started digging tunnels to undermine the Maastricht city gates. The men and women in the town countermined. They lit fires to suffocate the soldiers and poured boiling water into the tunnels, killing hundreds. The Spanish still managed to reach one of the town's gates, dug a big chamber underneath, packed it with gunpowder, and blew it up. It made a breach, but the defenders beat the Spanish back. A few days later, April 8, 1579, Farnese ordered a storm on the city. The royal soldiers faced men, women, and children standing on the walls, armed with the Repel the Spaniard starter pack, patent pending. Boiling water, stones, burning wreaths, the whole nine. They threw jars of chalk down to blind the men and dropped beehives right in the middle of the royal troops. They also detonated a massive mine, taking out 500 Spanish soldiers at once. But the citizens of Maastricht one-upped the other towns by sending down wagons with spikes and sharp blades attached to the wheels to amputate the soldiers as the carts cut through the troops. Hundreds of Spanish officers had fallen, half of them mortally wounded. Over 4,000 horribly mutilated Spanish soldiers lay writhing in agony on the ground. The bravest of the surviving officers pleaded with Farnese to break off the attack, but the general said, "Go back to the breach and tell the soldiers that Alessandro is coming to lead them into the city in triumph, or to perish with his comrades." He mounted his horse to charge at the city, but some men threw themselves in front of his horse to stop him. They argued that the king would be mad if he found out that his governor-general behaved like a common soldier. At last, Farnese sounded the retreat. The general quickly finished building his circumvallation line with 16 forts. A circumvallation line is a protective wall around the camp and town. If done well, it made a relief effort from the outside impossible and cut off the city's communications and supplies. The states were not forthcoming with money, but the prince managed to scrape together an army of 7,000 men. Maastricht was too far away for the Union of Utrecht to really care. When the prince's brother Johan arrived with General Philip von Hohenlohe, they saw it was hopeless. Maastricht was surrounded by a second Maastricht. All that was left for Willem to do was to arrange a truce from the peace negotiators at the Köln Conference, which had just started. But Farnese told Spanish negotiator Carlos, the Duke of Terranova, to just keep stalling long enough so he could take Maastricht. He said, "As for the suspension of arms, the longer it is deferred, the better." Envoys from Spain, Rome, Vienna, and the Habsburg Empire had come to Köln to negotiate a peace with the Netherlands. The royal party had no intention to yield. In fact, the Spanish were using this time to further split the country in half and give Farnese time to take Maastricht. General Juan Bautista de Taxis wrote in a confidential letter, "To divide them, no better method can be found than to amuse them with this peace negotiation." The southern states remained neutral, hoping the north would reconcile with the king. But there was no middle ground. The choice was king or Calvinist. The negotiators tried to buy Willem, like many other great nobles had already been bought. He could get anything he asked for, anything. Status, property, his son back. They offered him millions for his debts and his expenses, and $1 million extra in pocket money. All he had to do was to leave the Netherlands. Willem turned him down. Orange knew that they wanted to cut the head off the snake, so the body would founder. All right, he can stay in the Netherlands. No. The prince was a man whom kings were not rich enough to buy. Still, he didn't want to be an obstacle to an honorable peace either. Willem would resign his offices if a fair deal could be made only with him out of the picture. He said, "If I'm an obstacle, I'm ready to remove it. If you, therefore, in order to deprive the enemy of every right to inculpate us, think proper to choose another head and conductor of your affairs, I promise you to serve and to be obedient to him with all my heart. Thus shall we leave the enemy no standing place to work dissensions among us." As the negotiations dragged on, Terranova wrote the king that everyone was convinced that as long as Willem lived and controlled the affairs in the Netherlands, no deal could be made. Even if they allowed freedom of religion in Antwerp, Ghent and Utrecht, Willem would find a way to break the truce. The man must be possessed by the devil. He was sure of it. A few months later, the peace talks were over. The imperial envoys were exhausted. They complained that the rebels had been ridiculing their efforts, with everyone saying they would rather die than to accept terms. They had no choice but to leave the whole matter in the hands of God and the parties concerned. The Köln Conference made it crystal clear to Felipe and the Spanish government the Prince of Orange could not be bought by millions, nor by unlimited titles. There was no flattering him, and he could not be controlled. The only way to finish the revolt was to finish Orange. Felipe recalled Cardinal Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, made him a minister, and they came up with a plan to cut the head off the snake.